A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 992 of My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry, and we are sitting here in a surprisingly rainy Jerusalem today. I think the winter is trying to get one last word in before spring takes over. It is one of those grey, heavy mornings where the stone of the city looks almost purple, and it feels like the perfect atmosphere for the conversation we are about to have.
Herman Poppleberry here, and honestly, Corn, I will take the rain over the heat any day. It gives me an excuse to stay inside with my books and the latest policy papers. Our housemate Daniel actually sent us a prompt this morning that has been rattling around in my head ever since I read it. It is one of those topics that feels like it is at the very heart of why we live here, yet it is something people are often afraid to pick apart because it is so foundational to the Israeli identity. It is the kind of topic that makes people lean in or pull away, depending on how much they are willing to question the status quo.
It really is. The prompt is looking at the structural tension between Israel's self-conception as the nation-state of the Jewish people and the actual, messy, pluralistic reality of global Jewish identity in 2026. It is that classic question of representation. Can a sovereign state with its own borders, military, and tax system claim to represent a global diaspora that did not vote for it and might not even agree with its basic premises anymore? We are talking about the nation-state paradox. How can you be a modern democracy and a global ethnic representative simultaneously without those two roles eventually tearing each other apart?
And it is a paradox, right? Because on one hand, the very raison d'etre of the state was to be that safe haven, that representative body for a people who had no voice on the international stage for 2,000 years. But we are now nearly 80 years into this project. And the divergence between the State of Israel and the global Jewish community is not just a minor disagreement over policy anymore. It is starting to look like a fundamental structural break. We are moving from the era of post-1948 solidarity into a reality of fractured political alignment that we have never seen before.
And Daniel was asking us to explore whether this whole framework of being the representative of world Jewry is actually becoming a liability, not just for the diaspora, who often get blamed for things the Israeli government does, but for Israel itself. Does this entanglement fuel that old, nasty, dual loyalty trope? And why are we seeing more and more Israelis, people living right here in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, starting to question if we should just be a state of our citizens rather than a state of the entire Jewish world? Is the representative model a feature of Zionism that has simply outlived its usefulness? Or was it a bug from the beginning that we are only now forced to address?
It is a heavy lift, but I think we need to start with the historical context to understand why this was ever the model. If you go back to 1948, the state was essentially a rescue mission. The idea that Israel represented all Jews was a survival mechanism. It was about creating a unified front. But as we have discussed in previous episodes, specifically back in episode 474 when we talked about the price of autonomy, being a sovereign nation means you have to make cold, hard geopolitical decisions. Those decisions often clash with the liberal or universalist values of Jews living in, say, New York or London or Paris. In the early years, the memory of the Holocaust was so fresh that the need for a unified voice outweighed any internal ideological friction. But in 2026, that memory, while still vital, is no longer the sole glue holding the relationship together.
Right. And for a long time, there was this unspoken agreement. The diaspora provides the political and financial support, and Israel provides the identity and the ultimate insurance policy. But in 2026, that insurance policy feels very different to a 20-year-old Jewish student at a university in the United States than it did to their grandparents. We are seeing a shift from that post-Holocaust solidarity to a reality where the state is seen as a powerful actor on the world stage, rather than a vulnerable refuge. This shift changes the moral calculus of representation.
And that brings us to the core of the friction. When the Israeli government speaks, it often uses the royal we. It speaks on behalf of the Jewish people. Now, if you are a citizen of another country and your own government or your neighbors start looking at you as an extension of a foreign state's foreign policy, that creates a massive problem. It is what people call the collective responsibility mechanism. If Jerusalem makes a controversial move in a conflict, the local synagogue in a suburb of Chicago might see a protest or worse. The state claims the right to speak for them, and the world holds them accountable for what the state says. It is a trap.
This is where that dual loyalty trope gets its oxygen, unfortunately. It is a trope that has been used by anti-Semites for centuries to say that Jews aren't truly loyal to the countries they live in. But the irony here is that the official stance of the State of Israel sometimes inadvertently reinforces that. By claiming to be the national home and the representative of every Jew, regardless of their citizenship, it hands a tool to those who want to question the loyalty of diaspora communities. It creates a situation where a Jewish person in London is expected to answer for the actions of a government they didn't elect and might actively oppose.
It is a feedback loop, and it is not just an external pressure. We are seeing these emerging currents of thought right here in Israel that are arguing for a serious revision of this relationship. There is a movement that some are calling the New Diaspora Movement, though it is mostly made up of Israeli intellectuals and activists. They are arguing that the nation-state law of 2018, which was a huge moment in our legal history, might have actually overreached in a way that is now backfiring. They are saying that by codifying this global representation into law, we have actually weakened our own sovereignty by making our national identity dependent on people who don't share our daily reality.
For those who don't remember the details, that was the basic law, Israel as the nation, state of the Jewish people. It explicitly stated that the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. But it also included clauses about the state acting to preserve the affinity between the state and members of the Jewish people in the diaspora. On paper, it sounds like a beautiful sentiment of connection, but in practice, it anchors this idea that the state has a legal and moral mandate over people who have zero say in its governance. It complicates the legal status of non-Israeli Jews by making them part of a national project they might not want to be part of.
And that leads to the question of the unelected representative. If I am a Jewish person living in Melbourne, Australia, I didn't vote for the Knesset. I didn't vote for the Prime Minister. Yet, when the Prime Minister stands at a podium and says he is speaking for the entire Jewish world, he is essentially conscripting me into his political reality without my consent. That is a very tough pill to swallow for a generation that prizes individual autonomy and pluralism. It is a form of political ventriloquism. The state puts words into the mouths of millions of people who never asked for a spokesperson.
I think we saw a real breaking point with the legislative debates in the Knesset back in 2025 regarding the law of return. There was a lot of talk about narrowing the criteria for who can immigrate, specifically looking at the grandchild clause. The argument from the more conservative side of the aisle here was that we were bringing in too many people who weren't halakhically Jewish, which they felt was diluting the Jewish character of the state. But the reaction from the diaspora was pure fire. They saw it as Israel telling them, "We want your support, we want your money, we want your lobbying power, but we get to decide who is Jewish enough to belong." It was a moment where the representative claim was exposed as being conditional.
That was a huge moment of realization for many. It highlighted that the representative model is a one-way street. Israel wants to represent the diaspora when it is convenient for diplomatic leverage, but it doesn't necessarily want the diaspora to have a seat at the table when it comes to defining the very nature of the state. This is the trade-off of decoupling. If we stop claiming to represent them, we lose that leverage, but we also stop having to answer to their demands for a more pluralistic definition of Jewishness. It is a choice between being a global movement or a sovereign state. And this is why we are seeing that opinion gap we talked about in episode 981. The statistical earthquake of 2026 is real, Corn. The data is showing that the consensus is not just fading, it is structurally broken.
You are referring to that recent Pew Research Center data, right? The one from just a few months ago.
The 2026 report showed a 14% drop in emotional attachment to Israel among American Jews under the age of 35 compared to just 6 years ago in 2020. That is a massive shift in a very short amount of time. If 14% of your core base of support effectively checks out, you can't keep claiming to be their representative in any meaningful way. It becomes a fiction. And it is not just a lack of interest, it is a growing sense that the state's actions are actively harmful to the diaspora's own values and safety.
And it is a dangerous fiction because it creates a sense of entitlement on both sides that leads to resentment. Israel feels entitled to the diaspora's loyalty, and the diaspora feels entitled to demand that Israel behaves like a progressive Western democracy that mirrors their local values. When neither side gets what they want, the relationship turns toxic. I have heard some Israeli thinkers argue that we need to dehyphenate the relationship. Instead of being the Jewish state, maybe we need to focus on being the Israeli state. This would mean focusing on the people who actually live here, pay taxes here, and serve in the military here, regardless of their religious background.
That is the state of its citizens model. It is a controversial idea here because it feels to many like a betrayal of the Zionist dream. If Israel is just a state like any other, then what was the point of the last century of struggle? But the counter-argument is that by trying to be everything to everyone, we are ending up being a source of instability for the very people we claim to protect. We are seeing the risk of instrumentalization. The state uses the diaspora for diplomatic leverage, and the diaspora uses the state as a blank canvas for their own identity formation. Neither side is seeing the other as a real autonomous entity.
Let's talk about that security burden for a second. We live here in Jerusalem. We see the security reality every day. When the government here makes a decision, we live with the consequences, whether that is a rocket siren or an economic shift. But when the government claims to represent a person in London, and then that person in London gets harassed on the street because of an Israeli military operation, that person is bearing a security burden for a state they don't live in and didn't vote for. It is a form of political taxation without representation. But instead of money, the tax is paid in social cohesion and personal safety. It is an unfair distribution of risk.
It is a brutal way to put it, but you are right. And it works the other way too. When diaspora organizations lobby the American government to take a specific stance on Israeli policy, they are influencing the lives of people living in Sderot or Haifa. If those policies turn out to be disastrous, the people in New York or Washington don't have to deal with the fallout. They don't have to send their kids to the front lines. This mutual interference is starting to look less like a family bond and more like a dysfunctional codependency. We are seeing a generation of Jews in the West who are saying, I don't want to be a lobbyist for a country I don't live in, and I don't want that country's actions to define my moral standing in my own community.
I think this is why the rise of post-Zionist Jewish identity in the West is so significant. It is not just about being anti-Israel, although that certainly exists. It is about a desire to decouple Jewish identity from the geopolitical fortunes of a Middle Eastern state. For many Gen Z Jews, their Jewishness is about community, social justice, or religious practice, and they don't see why a government in Jerusalem should be the arbiter of what that means. They are looking at the polling data from 2026 and seeing that their peers are far more concerned with climate change or local inequality than with the defense of a sovereign state thousands of miles away.
And we are seeing the second-order effects of this in the world of philanthropy. Historically, Jewish giving was very Israel-centric. You sent your checks to the Jewish National Fund or the various organizations building infrastructure here. But the 2026 data shows a major shift in institutional funding toward local community-centric Jewish philanthropy. People want to build their own schools, their own community centers, and their own cultural institutions where they live. They are realizing that if they want a future in the diaspora, they have to invest in the diaspora, not just treat it as a waiting room for Aliyah. This is a direct challenge to the classical Zionist notion of the negation of the diaspora.
The negation of the diaspora was the idea that Jewish life outside of Israel is inherently fragile and destined to disappear. But if the diaspora is actually thriving and building its own distinct, non-Israel-centric identity, then the whole representative model of the state collapses. Israel becomes a very important, very powerful center of Jewish life, but it is no longer the center. It becomes one of many nodes in a global network. This requires a massive psychological shift for Israelis who have been told that we are the heart of the world.
It becomes a peer-to-peer relationship rather than a parent-child relationship. And honestly, I think that might be healthier for everyone. If Israel stops claiming to speak for all Jews, it gains a certain kind of diplomatic freedom. It doesn't have to worry as much about how its every move will be perceived by a donor in Florida or a student in California. It can act purely in its own national interest as a sovereign state. It can be more honest about its own needs and its own limitations.
But is that even possible? I mean, we are a small country in a very tough neighborhood. We rely on that international support. If we let go of the representative claim, do we lose the very thing that makes us special in the eyes of our most important allies? Does the United States support Israel because it is a strategic asset, or because it is the representative of a people with whom the American public has a deep connection? If we break that connection, we might be more autonomous, but we might also be more alone.
That is the gamble, isn't it? But look at episode 979, where we talked about the crisis in Ireland. We saw how the righteousness shield, as we called it, is starting to crack. When the state uses its role as the protector of the Jewish people as a shield against any and all criticism, it eventually wears thin. People start to see it as instrumentalization. They see the state using a global identity as a tactical tool for public relations, or hasbara, and that breeds cynicism. It makes the state's moral arguments feel like marketing slogans rather than genuine principles.
It also makes it much harder to fight actual anti-Semitism. If every criticism of the state is labeled as anti-Semitic because the state is the representative of the Jewish people, then the word starts to lose its meaning. We talked about this in episode 743, the fine line between criticism and anti-Semitism. When the state blurs that line intentionally for political gain, it leaves diaspora communities more vulnerable because the real threats get lost in the noise of political debate. It is like crying wolf. If everything is anti-Semitism, then eventually nothing is.
There was a really interesting piece in one of the Hebrew dailies last week arguing that the current model is actually a form of Israeli colonialism over Jewish identity. That by insisting on being the center, Israel is stifling the organic development of Jewish cultures elsewhere. It is a provocative thought, especially coming from a conservative-leaning writer. But it reflects this growing feeling that the state needs to grow up and let the diaspora grow up too. We need to stop treating the diaspora as a resource to be managed and start treating it as a separate, though related, entity.
It is like the state is an overbearing parent who won't let their 50-year-old child move out of the house. But in this case, the child has already moved out, started their own family, and has a completely different lifestyle, and the parent is still trying to pick out their clothes and tell them who to vote for. At some point, the child is just going to stop answering the phone, and we are seeing that in the polling. Silence is the most telling part. It is not just the people who are actively protesting, it is the growing number of Jews who just don't care. They don't feel a connection, they don't feel a responsibility, and they don't feel represented.
For them, Israel is just another country on the news. If the state of Israel continues to insist it represents those people, it just looks out of touch. It looks like a relic of the 20th century trying to operate in the 21st. So what does a dehyphenated relationship actually look like? If we move away from this representative model, how do we still maintain a connection? Because I don't think anyone is saying we should just cut all ties and pretend we aren't part of the same history. We share a language, a heritage, and a lot of trauma. You can't just delete that.
I think it starts with a more honest, more limited definition of the state's role. Israel can be a cultural and spiritual center. It can be a place where any Jew can come if they are in danger. That is the core of the law of return, and I think that remains vital. But it should stop pretending it has a political mandate for those who don't live here. It should speak for the citizens of Israel, and let the Jewish communities of the world speak for themselves. This would mean that when the Prime Minister speaks at the United Nations, he is speaking for the 9 million people in Israel, not the 15 million Jews worldwide.
That would require a massive shift in our own internal discourse. Think about how we talk in the Knesset, how we talk in our schools. We are taught from a young age that we are the vanguard for the entire people. Shifting that to being a state of its citizens is a psychological revolution. It means acknowledging that an Israeli Jew and an American Jew are two different things, sharing a common heritage but living in different realities with different interests. It means accepting that our destiny is not necessarily their destiny.
It also means recognizing that Zionism itself has served its primary purpose. The state exists. It is powerful. It is no longer a fragile dream that needs constant, unanimous defense from every corner of the world. We can afford to have a more complex, more distant relationship. In fact, we might need it to survive the next century. If we keep trying to pull the diaspora into our conflicts, we will eventually pull them apart. We are already seeing the strain in Jewish communities in the United States and Europe. The internal debates over Israel are becoming so heated that they are threatening the stability of synagogues and community centers.
And we have seen the rise of these alternative organizations that are trying to facilitate this peer-to-peer model. They aren't about hasbara or advocacy, they are about genuine cultural exchange. They treat Jerusalem and New York as two equal centers of Jewish life. That is a very different vibe than the old model of the diaspora being a piggy bank for the state. It is about mutual learning rather than one-way instruction. It acknowledges that the diaspora has things to teach Israel about pluralism and minority rights, just as Israel has things to teach the diaspora about sovereignty and self-defense.
It is much more respectful. It acknowledges the autonomy of both sides. And I think it actually makes the connection stronger because it is based on choice rather than obligation or guilt. When you choose to engage with Israel as a peer, it is a much more meaningful connection than feeling forced to defend it because you happen to have been born Jewish. It moves the relationship from a biological necessity to a cultural choice. And in the modern world, choices are always more durable than obligations.
I wonder how this impacts the dual loyalty trope in the long run. If the state explicitly says, we don't represent you, we only represent our citizens, does that take the wind out of the sails of the bigots? Or will they just find another way to target people? Bigots will always find a way, but we shouldn't make it easier for them. By clearly defining the boundaries of the state's sovereignty, we provide a clear legal and political distinction that can be used to protect diaspora communities. It allows a Jewish person in France to say, I am a French citizen, my loyalty is to France, and what the government in Jerusalem does has nothing to do with my status here.
It is also a more honest position for us here in Israel. We often complain about the diaspora trying to interfere in our politics, but we can't have it both ways. We can't demand their money and their political support, and then tell them to shut up when they have an opinion on our judicial reform or our border policies. If we want them to stop interfering, we have to stop claiming to represent them. We have to accept that if they are not part of the collective, they don't get a vote, but we also don't get to use them as a shield.
It is about mutual respect and mutual boundaries. It is a maturation of the Zionist project. We have moved from the emergency rescue phase to the established nation-state phase. And a mature nation-state doesn't need to claim a global population to justify its existence. It justifies its existence by serving its citizens and upholding its laws. It is about moving from an ethnic movement to a civic reality.
You know, it is interesting to look at how this ties back to the conservative worldview we often discuss. There is a strong emphasis on national sovereignty and the importance of the nation-state as the primary unit of political organization. In a way, the current representative model is almost a globalist or transnationalist approach that contradicts the idea of a clear sovereign nation-state. By clinging to this global representation, Israel is acting more like an empire or a movement than a state. It is a very 19th century way of thinking that doesn't fit the 21st century world of clear borders and international law.
That is a brilliant point, Corn. A truly conservative approach would favor a strong, sovereign Israel that looks after its own interests and its own people. The idea that a state has a mystical connection to people across the globe is actually quite a radical, revolutionary idea. Returning to a more traditional model of citizenship and sovereignty might actually be the most conservative thing we could do. It grounds the state in reality rather than in a global ideological project.
It also aligns with the idea of individual responsibility. Every person should be judged on their own actions and their own loyalties, not as a representative of a collective they didn't choose to lead. It is a more dignified way to treat people, both here and abroad. It allows for a plurality of Jewish identities to flourish without being crushed by the weight of a single state's political agenda.
I think the takeaways here are pretty clear, even if they are difficult to implement. We need to move toward a dehyphenated peer-to-peer relationship. We need to recognize that Jewishness and Zionism, while deeply linked historically, are no longer synonymous in the global political arena of 2026, and we need to be very careful about how we use the language of representation. We need to stop using the word we when we really mean the Israeli government.
For our listeners who are navigating these conversations in their own lives, I think the key is to avoid the binary traps. You can support the right of the State of Israel to exist and thrive, while also being deeply critical of the idea that it represents you as an individual. And you can be a proud Israeli who loves this country, while also believing that our relationship with the diaspora needs a major structural update. It is not an all-or-nothing proposition. We can have a relationship that is based on honesty and distance, rather than on myth and entanglement.
And if you want to dive deeper into the data that supports this, I really recommend going back and listening to episode 981. The numbers in that opinion gap study are really the smoking gun for why the old model is failing. It is not just a feeling, it is a measurable sociological shift. The 14% drop in attachment is just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that is a fundamental change in how young Jews see themselves and their place in the world.
Also, episode 743 is great for understanding how to navigate these topics without crossing into the tropes we talked about. It is a fine line, as we said, but it is one we have to learn to walk if we want to have an honest conversation about our future. We have to be able to talk about the problems with the representative model without giving ammunition to those who want to destroy the state entirely. It is about reform, not abolition.
This has been a fascinating one to dig into. It is a topic that hits close to home for us, living here in Jerusalem and seeing these tensions play out in our own neighborhoods. I think we are at the beginning of a very long and probably painful process of redefinition, but it is one that is long overdue. The rain outside might be a good metaphor for it. It is cold and messy, but it is necessary for something new to grow.
I agree. It is about moving toward a more honest, more adult relationship. And that is always hard, but it is usually better in the end. So, a big thank you to our housemate Daniel for sending this one in. It definitely pushed us to think about our own reality here in a new way. It is good to be challenged on the things we take for granted.
Definitely. And hey, if you have been listening to my weird props for a while and you are finding these deep dives valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps the show reach new people who are looking for this kind of nuanced exploration. We are trying to build a community of people who aren't afraid to ask the hard questions.
It really does. You can find us on Spotify, of course, and our website is at myweirdprompts.com. We have the full archive there, so you can search for those past episodes we mentioned. We are creeping up on 1,000 episodes, which is a bit wild to think about. It feels like we just started yesterday, but the world has changed so much since then.
It is a lot of talking, Corn, a lot of talking. But as long as there are weird prompts and complicated realities to pick apart, I think we will have plenty more to say.
And a lot of thinking. All right, I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. Thanks for joining us today on My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive into whatever weird and wonderful ideas come our way. Stay dry if you're in Jerusalem, and stay curious wherever you are.
Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird